Picture a studio that gave the world one of the most emotional moments in gaming history. The ending of Season 1 of The Walking Dead, after which millions of players sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what they'd just experienced. A studio whose games were discussed not just by gamers, but by mainstream journalists who had never written about video games before. A studio that simultaneously held licenses for Batman, Game of Thrones, Marvel, Jurassic Park, Guardians of the Galaxy, and even Minecraft. Now picture that same studio, just a few years later, laying off almost its entire staff in a single day. No severance, no warning, not even a week of extended health coverage. People found out they'd lost their jobs on a Friday morning and walked out the door with a box of personal belongings. How does a company that created one of the most important narrative projects in gaming history, a company with millions in sales and multiple Game of the Year awards, turn into a textbook example of how not to run a business? And why does the name Telltale Games still exist today, even though the people who built it are long gone? Today we're breaking down the entire story step by step. The rise, the mistakes that seemed small at the time, the collapse, and what happened to the brand afterward. Stick around until the end. There's a twist in this story that most people don't know about. The story of Telltale begins in July 2004. Three developers, Kevin Bruner, Dan Connors, and Troy Molander, had just left LucasArts, the legendary studio behind Monkey Island. Sam and Max hit the road in Grim Fandango. The problem was that LucasArts leadership had just decided to abandon the adventure game genre entirely, the very genre these three people loved and had built their careers on. Instead of looking for jobs elsewhere, they decided to start their own studio and prove to the entire industry that adventure games were far from dead. That's how Telltale Games was born. A name meant to evoke a storyteller, someone who reveals a tale piece by piece. The idea that set them apart from day one was episodic distribution. Instead of releasing one big game every few years like traditional studios did, Telltale decided to release games in installments, like a TV series, a season of roughly 5 episodes, with new episodes arriving every 2 to 3 months. For the mid-2000s, when digital distribution was just starting to take off, this was a fairly bold and even risky move. In its early years, Telltale worked with licenses that had devoted but relatively small fan bases. The comic Bone, the classic Sam and Max, the British claymation Wallace and Gromit, and later, even the web series Homestar Runner. These weren't million-dollar hits, but they let a small team survive in the market and gradually build their own technology. A game engine called the Telltale Tool, developed under co-founder Kevin Bruner specifically for making narrative, dialogue-driven games quickly and cheaply. Starting around 2010, the company began landing much bigger licenses, Back to the Future, and shortly after, Jurassic Park, the game. This was an important step forward. Telltale learned how to negotiate with major rights holders to show them that an interactive story based on their franchise could be profitable and safe for the brand. And this hard-won skill would, within a few years, lead them to the biggest success of their entire history. And, as it would later turn out, to their own downfall. April 2012. Telltale releases the first episode of a game based on The Walking Dead, not the AMC TV show, but Robert Kirkman's comic book directly. And this game becomes a genuine cultural phenomenon, on a scale nobody, including the studio itself, had expected. The secret to its success wasn't graphics, deliberately simple, styled like a hand-drawn comic, or combat, which barely existed. The secret was choice. Players constantly had to make brutal moral decisions in a matter of seconds, Which of two people to save, who to lie to, who to leave behind to die, so others could live. The screen would flash, "This character will remember that," and it gave players the sense that every decision truly mattered, even though many storylines actually funneled back to the same key plot points regardless of the choice made. The game won Game of the Year from several major outlets, an award that usually went to big-budget blockbusters with massive budgets, not a small episodic game from a studio that, a year earlier, was barely known outside a niche circle of adventure game fans. Sales were counted in the millions of copies, and, most importantly for the business, the success opened doors to the biggest rights holders in entertainment. Suddenly, a small studio out of San Rafael, California, had Marvel and HBO wanting to work with them. It seemed like everything had finally come together after 8 years of grinding in the shadow of the big publishers. But this is exactly the moment when the bomb that would tear the company apart from the inside began to be planted. The success of The Walking Dead created one dangerous illusion in the minds of leadership and the board of directors, that the winning formula had finally been found, and now it could simply be copy-pasted onto any other license they could acquire. Game of Thrones? Same engine, same choice-driven structure, same episode release pace. The Wolf Among Us, a detective story set in a world of fairy tale characters? Same approach. Batman, the Telltale series? Same formula again. Minecraft story mode? Same thing. Guardians of the Galaxy, the Telltale series? Same thing again. Instead of continuing to experiment with the format the way they had in their early years, the company started literally stamping out games from the same template, changing only the scenery and the characters. And when a company stops taking risks and starts repeating itself instead of growing, that almost always leads to trouble sooner or later. This is where the most important, and also the saddest, part of this story begins. What was happening not on screen, but inside the office? To keep up with releasing new episodes every few months across several franchises at once, Telltale turned game development into a literal assembly line. At its peak, the studio was simultaneously producing multiple seasons of different games, all running on the aging Telltale tool engine, which had originally been built for much simpler, cheaper projects like Sam and Max, and was now straining under a far bigger scale and more complex visuals than it was ever designed to handle. Developers who later spoke to journalists described constant overtime, unstable and often chaotic management, and a culture where hard deadlines were prioritized over product quality, and even over the health of the team itself. The Verge published a major investigative piece on the toxic atmosphere inside the company, based on conversations with dozens of former and current employees, and it became public, documented confirmation of what the industry had long whispered about behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the quality of the games themselves began visibly slipping, and it was visible to the naked eye, even for ordinary players, not just critics. The same engine, the same choices with consequences structure, the same visual style, similar animations, and even the same recurring bugs, whether it was Batman, Game of Thrones, or any other license. Players who had once been thrilled by the novelty of the format after The Walking Dead were now increasingly writing reviews along the lines of, "This is the same game again, just with different characters and a slightly different coat of paint." And licenses, unlike a studio's own original ideas, are genuinely expensive. Telltale paid significant sums to rights holders for the privilege of using other companies' franchises, and increasingly got lower critic scores, mixed player reception, and falling sales compared to expectations. A business model that worked brilliantly when there was one truly brilliant, fresh game fell apart fast the moment there were too many games running at once, none of which felt outstanding or fresh anymore. By the end of 2017, the first genuinely alarming warning sign hit the entire industry. The company laid off around 25% of its staff, roughly 90 people, in one stroke. Officially, leadership framed this as internal restructuring meant to slow down production, improve the quality of future games, and eventually retire the aging Telltale tool in favor of a more modern, flexible game engine. On paper, and in the press releases, the plan sounded perfectly reasonable, even hopeful. In practice, there was almost no time left to actually save the company, and trust inside the team had already been seriously damaged to really understand how fast things fell apart. It helps to look at what was happening release by release, because the decline wasn't sudden, it was gradual, and you can trace it title by title. Game of Thrones, the Telltale series, released in 2014 and 2015, was an ambitious attempt to do for HBO's world what The Walking Dead had done for Kirkman's comic. It had a strong cast of original characters and some genuinely tense moments. But critics and fans increasingly noted that the choices felt hollow, that no matter what you picked, the plot dragged your character toward the same brutal fate anyway. For a show built entirely around the idea that anyone can die, a game where death felt scripted rather than earned undercut the entire appeal of the license. Batman, the Telltale series, which followed in 2016, tried something more interesting on paper, letting players decide whether Bruce Wayne leaned toward Batman's brutality or a more restrained, detective-driven approach. But it was still built on the same underlying engine, the same quick-time event combat, the same dialogue wheel. Reviewers respected the ambition but kept coming back to the same complaint: technical issues, frame drops, and bugs that had been present in Telltale games for years and never seemed to get fixed. Minecraft Story Mode, released in 2015, was in some ways Telltale's most commercially savvy move, attaching their formula to the single biggest gaming brand on the planet. It sold well precisely because of the Minecraft name, not because it pushed the format forward. And Guardians of the Galaxy, the Telltale series, released in 2017, arrived to warmer reviews than some of its siblings, with critics noting that snappier dialogue and a stronger soundtrack briefly made the formula feel fresh again. But by then it was already too late to reverse the financial trajectory the company was on. Taken together, this run of games shows exactly what happens when a company mistakes volume for growth. Each individual title wasn't necessarily bad. Some were genuinely well-reviewed. The problem was the accumulation. 5, 6, 7 simultaneous productions on one aging engine, each one requiring the same overworked teams to hit the same brutal deadlines, all while licensing fees to Marvel, HBO, Netflix, DC, and Mojang kept draining a shrinking cash reserve. Early 2018 gave Telltale one more glimmer of hope, and it looked like the company was genuinely trying to change course. The company struck a partnership with Netflix. The streaming giant licensed the rights to create an interactive adaptation of Minecraft, story mode specifically for its platform, while Telltale, in turn, secured the rights to make a full game based on the show Stranger Things. This looked like a serious attempt to move beyond the old model and find entirely new revenue streams outside the traditional console and PC gaming market. At the same time, the studio was working intensely on what was arguably the most anticipated project of its final years, the fourth and final season of The Walking Dead, meant to bring a fitting, emotional close to the very story that had made the company famous worldwide in the first place. But the financial hole created by years of overexpansion turned out to be far too deep to be closed by partial successes. The company needed an entire new round of serious investment just to stay afloat a little longer. Negotiations were held with several potential investors, including the TV network AMC, the rights holder for The Walking Dead show, and the Korean publisher Smilegate. Both, at some point, seriously considered investing in Telltale. But both potential investors ultimately walked away from the talks, one after the other, with little explanation. On September 21st, 2018, literally the day after the last real funding negotiations collapsed for good, Telltale suddenly announced what it officially called a majority studio closure. Only about 25 people remained at the company, a small skeleton crew whose sole job was to fulfill the last remaining obligations to partners and the board of directors. Everyone else, the vast majority of the roughly 275 employees at the time, was let go that very same day, within a single hour. No advance warning whatsoever, no severance pay, with barely a week of extended health coverage. This happened just weeks before the planned release of the second episode of The Walking Dead's final season, a game people had been waiting years for, meant to be the true emotional conclusion of a series that had begun back in 2012. Pete Hawley, the company's CEO at the time, who had only taken the role a year earlier, called it an incredibly difficult year and honestly admitted the team's efforts ultimately hadn't translated into sales. Co-founder Dan Connors later told Variety that once the last round of funding talks fell through, leadership had no real choice but to halt production entirely. On October 11th, 2018, Telltale officially began a legal process very similar to bankruptcy, a so-called assignment for the benefit of creditors, and began full liquidation, selling off all company assets and pulling its own games from sale on Steam entirely. A studio that had once given the entire industry one of the most emotional endings in its history ended its own story with no proper ending at all, simply vanishing in the middle of releasing its own most important, most anticipated game, the biggest human, and at the same time creative, tragedy in this story was that the final season of The Walking Dead was left unfinished. Just 2 episodes short of the ending players had been waiting years for, the very ending the whole series had been building toward. This is where Skybound Games enters the picture. The company founded by Robert Kirkman himself, the creator of the Walking Dead comic, which held the franchise rights. Skybound agreed to finish the last 2 episodes, hiring part of the original development team that had just lost their jobs along with the rest of the company. The 3rd episode came out in January 2019, and the final, 4th episode followed in March of that same year. Players finally got the ending they'd been waiting 8 years for. But the fate of the studio's other projects turned out to be far more complicated, and, frankly, far sadder. The sequel to The Wolf Among Us, which was already in active development at the moment of the studio's sudden closure, was entirely scrapped along with the company itself and the team working on it. The planned Stranger Things game for Netflix never got past the paper agreement stage and never saw the light of day in the form the original Telltale had envisioned. By late 2018, the assets and numerous licenses of the now bankrupt Telltale were acquired by an entirely new holding company called LCG Entertainment. In essence, LCG Entertainment bought the right to use the name Telltale Games itself, along with a portfolio of licenses, much like an author might keep publishing books under an already well-known pen name, even if it's a completely different person behind the keyboard now. Legally, the original Telltale Games, the company 3 friends founded back in 2004, no longer existed in any form. Only a trademark and a portfolio of rights remained, now used by an entirely different business under entirely different owners. At the Game Awards in late 2019, something happened that shocked absolutely everyone who assumed the story of Telltale was long since closed for good. The surprise announcement of The Wolf Among Us 2, once again under the very same familiar Telltale Games brand. But this was not a true resurrection of the original development team. The new game was handed to an entirely separate studio, Ad Hoc Studio, founded by several former key employees of the original Telltale who had directly worked on the first Wolf Among Us. LCG Entertainment had, in essence, bought the brand, the recognizable name, the licenses, and the legacy, but not the company itself, with its specific people, its office culture, good or bad, and not the particular creative approach that had once made Telltale's early games special. This perfectly illustrates what the name Telltale Games actually became after 2019. Simply a label now used by a completely different business with its own team and its own decisions. The name lives on. The logo keeps appearing on new releases. But the company that, with its own hands, made The Walking Dead what we all remember it as, the one that grew too fast, repeatedly blew through deadlines, and burned out from the inside, effectively stopped existing back in the fall of 2018, that it's tempting to treat Telltale's collapse as a one-off horror story, a single company that made uniquely bad decisions. But the uncomfortable truth is that Telltale was an extreme, highly visible example of a problem that runs through the entire video game industry: crunch culture. Around the same years Telltale was working its staff into the ground, other major studios were facing their own public reckonings. Rockstar Games faced intense criticism after reports described grueling 100-hour weeks during the final stretch of development on Red Dead Redemption 2. BioWare's culture came under scrutiny following the troubled launch of Anthem, with former staff describing years of unclear direction and last-minute crunch. Naughty Dog, the studio behind The Last of Us, has repeatedly faced questions about extended overtime ahead of major releases. What made Telltale's case stand out wasn't that crunch happened there. Crunch, unfortunately, has been treated as close to normal across the industry for decades. What made it stand out was the combination of factors. A company simultaneously juggling more licensed productions than its aging technology could realistically support, a leadership team chasing the shadow of one enormous early hit instead of building something new, and, in the end, a shutdown so abrupt that employees had less notice than companies are legally required to give in many jurisdictions for mass layoffs. That abruptness is actually why Telltale's story became such a widely cited case study afterward, discussed in business schools and game design courses alike. It's a compact, almost textbook illustration of how overexpansion, technical debt, and a toxic pace of production can sink a studio that, on paper, had every reason to succeed. Proven IP, critical acclaim, a beloved format, and partnerships with some of the biggest entertainment brands on Earth. The story of Telltale Games is arguably one of the clearest examples in the entire industry of how a company can die not from a lack of talent or good ideas, but from its own success arriving too early. One brilliant hit created a dangerous illusion in leadership's mind that a universal formula had been found, one that could now be replicated almost endlessly across any license they could buy. That illusion eventually led to assembly line game production, mass burnout across the team, outdated technology that could no longer handle the scale, and a total loss of the creative uniqueness that had once made this small studio genuinely special compared to the big publishers. When money and deadlines are consistently placed above people and above product quality, sooner or later the bill comes due. Telltale Games paid it in full, through the liquidation of the entire company and the shattered careers of hundreds of people let go within a single hour, with no warning at all. For anyone watching this who works in games or dreams of running their own studio someday, the lesson isn't really don't succeed. It's that success has to be followed by reinvestment in tools, in people, in giving a team room to breathe between projects, rather than treated as proof that the current pace can simply be scaled up forever. The moment a studio's growth outruns its technology and its people's capacity to sustain it, the countdown has already started, even if the games still look fine on store shelves for another year or two. The brand formally lives on under an entirely new owner with new people. But the real Telltale Games, the one that gave the world one of the most important and emotional moments in the entire history of video games, effectively ended in the fall of 2018. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments which Telltale game you remember best. Next time, we'll break down another studio that soared to incredible heights and fell just as fast.